This video focuses on Darwin's From the Descent of Man. I want to start with a little bit of context in thinking about the literary text. In 1897, Mark Twain visited London for Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee, that is her 60th anniversary of when she ascended to the throne. This is what Mark Twain said on his visit. British history is 2,000 years old, and yet, in a good many ways, the world has moved farther ahead since the Queen was born than it moved in all the rest of the 2,000 put together. It is significant here to think about the rapid change happening in the world. In Great Britain during the 19th century, we see the rapid expansion of the railroad. We see the rapid expansion of industrialization, and we see England too becoming an imperial power in the world. In thinking about too and moving into Victorian literature, there are issues that come to the forefront here. The selection that you have is labeled Victorian Issues Evolution in the Norton Anthology to Victorian Literature, and some of the other Victorian issues besides evolution that are important to consider too. That rapid growth of industrialization, the woman question too, what to do with those women, how do we handle women who are looking for the vote, for example. Also, the role of Great Britain as an imperial power as it expands around the globe, as its reach expands around the globe. If we think about the Age of Enlightenment as focused on the role of the rational mind, the intellect, here in the Victorian era we see the Victorians aiming to use that intellect to know everything. It is during this period too where we see the expansion, development of museums, museums in particular, those like this is the Field Museum in Chicago, which was originally built during the Columbian Exposition in the 1890s. So we're talking about a little bit later period than what we're focusing on for our class, but I think it is a good example of all those collections of stuffed animals, specimens that were brought back from the far reaches of the world for the Victorians to attempt to analyze and to, in many ways, deconstruct it, to try to figure out what they are, what their species is, to analyze scientifically these various specimens of animals and other matter from the earth too. And so it's during this period you see this rapid expansion of this ideal of trying to know all. Here is a map of the voyage of the Beagle. You probably have heard of the ship that Darwin was on. He was one who was there on the ship for scientific purposes. He, as you see here, the route of the Beagle took them around the southern tip of South America. Then you see the Galapagos Islands, where he did a lot of his research. This was a voyage in the 1830s. But obviously it greatly impacted his research that led to the concepts of evolution. The text that you have, I will hold you specifically responsible for the Darwin piece from the Descent of Man, but I've included the other selections too to give you some context for thinking about the Darwin piece. So as you write on the exam or in your paper perhaps if you choose to work on Darwin, then please refer to these other texts if you want to make a particular point about the context for Darwin's piece. And notice too, this is from the Descent of Man. This is not Origin of Species that the Norton includes. For Sir Edmund Gosse, this selection gives us some information too about how a scientist of the time period who had strong religious views was attempting to deal with this internal conflict too that he was facing as to between two parts of himself, essentially, between the scientist and the religious person. Now, Edmund Goss is the son who is writing about his father. Actually, we have two selections here that are about fathers written by sons. This one, Edmund Goss writes about his father, Philip Henry Goss. The dilemma that he faces, too, is one that he saw as totally irreconcilable. It is between those two parts, the scientific and the religious. Edmund Goss outlines that conflict as the selection opens. If you look at the top of page 1617 too, as well, he says, it was not really a paradox, it was a fallacy. It was an unsound argument, in other words. If he could only have known it, but he allowed the turbid volume of superstition to drown the delicate stream of reason. He took one step in the service of truth, and then he drew back in agony and accepted the servitude of error. And I find this selection actually, it is a very emotional reading it too, saying the agony that this man was going through with this internal conflict. If you flip over to page 1680, we see how Philip Henry Goss attempted to explain what he saw in geological findings in the fossils. About halfway through the top paragraph on 1618, there's a sentence that starts, My father, after long reflection, prepared a theory of his own, which, as he fondly hoped, would take the wind out of Lyell's sails and justify geology to godly readers of Genesis. So he was trying to explain what the scientists were saying in a context that other religious people could accept. It was very briefly that there had been no gradual modification of the surface of the earth or slow development of organic forms, but that when the catastrophic act of creation took place, the world presented instantly the structural appearance of a planet on which life had long existed. Now, people in the press got a hold of this. Continuing on the next paragraph, the theory, coarsely enough and to my father's great indignation, was defined by a hasty press as being this: that God hid the fossils in the rocks in order to tempt geologists into infidelity. He became a sort of laughingstock. People on in both camps, the scientific and camp and the Christians too, as this essay says, laughed and threw away this explanation that Goss was trying to set forth. Truly, I think, trying to set forth for him to find some way of explaining, bringing the two together. I think the ending is very telling too. If you look at the top of page 619. He could not give up the painful and slow conclusion of 25 years' study of geology and believe that God has written on the rocks one enormous and superfluous lie. As all this happened or failed to happen, a gloom, cold and dismal, descended upon our morning teacups. This is an excerpt. There's more that comes after this, but I think that it's an interesting closing for the Norton selection, because you really get a sense of a man who is truly in crisis, who can find no way out of bringing, at least in his mind, of bringing religion and science together. And I would emphasize, at least in his mind, because others have. The second selection that we have in here is the Huxley piece from the Life and Letters of Thomas Henry Huxley. Once again, the son is Leonard, and then the father is Thomas Henry. This selection focuses specifically on the famous Oxford meeting of 1860. Now, this is the story that the son tells about what happened to his dad. There is no transcript of what actually happened, a transcript that remains of this meeting. So the son put this together from other sources. You see him quoting from other sources here. The focus is on a debate that his dad had with his dad, who defended Darwin, his debate with the bishop, Wilberforce, who was, as our book tells us, or as the selection tells us, ready to smash Darwin. And this is an instance, though, of, at least Leonard Huxley tells us too, this is an instance, though, of like a situation where the theory of evolution is given a hearing. This, though, is not your usual scientific meeting. There were 700 people there, although our notes tell us that the general public was not invited. The room was packed full of ladies whose white handkerchiefs waving and fluttering in the air at the end of the bishop's speech were an unforgettable factor in the acclamation of the crowd. And women will be fainting too because of what they are hearing being said about evolution. Now, even though this is supposed to be a meeting that is based on science, we see here that even though it's emphasized that you should only speak up in this meeting if you have a valid argument to be made, the question is, what is valid too? We have two very, at least in the context of this argument, two very different perspectives with the scientific evolution theory and religion on the other side. We have Professor Henslow, who is saying that the discussion needs to be on scientific grounds only. Wilberforce, the bishop, is saying too. He spoke the speech, according to what Huxley tells us. Wilberforce spoke the speech that you know, because this is a speech that has gone down into history. And the question about his mother being an ape or his grandmother. Obviously, there's a flaw in this argument that Wilberforce is making that is, he's sort of like distracting from the real argument by throwing out the possibility of his mother being an ape or his grandmother being an ape. Also, there is the quote from Huxley in here, the dad. He was not ashamed to have a monkey as his ancestor, for his ancestor. Actually, this is the son's summary of what Dad said. He was not ashamed to have a monkey for his ancestor, but he would be ashamed to be connected with a man who used great gifts to obscure the truth. An attack on the person there, using the ad hominem attack here, saying that he would be ashamed to be connected with a person who obscured the truth. Not an argument then about the concept itself. Now, I bring these in just to emphasize the point too, that on the one hand, this was a conversation that was labeled as being a scientific meeting, but in fact too, we see it degrading into much more personal attacks. This really shows too how Darwin's theories upended society. The main selection that we're focusing on is the Darwin piece from The Descent of Man. I'll just introduce it, and then I think I need to break this up into a second video too to get everything in. We see here too larger questions of the time that are being asked. It's not solely was there evolution, but these larger questions too. Is there order in the universe? What is that order? Who has control? Does anyone have control? Is it God who has control? So these are essential questions that are asked.